So let's start with the basics. What is the purpose of a protocol? So this is a simple definition that comes from ICAG 6, the GCP. It's a plan for conducting the study, and the primary elements of it are the objectives. Why are we doing this? The methodology, the endpoints. What are we going to measure? How are we going to analyze it? And how is the study organized? So the roadmap. And each of these elements has a specific purpose. The GCP guidance has a section on the protocol template, but the guidance document also contains other sections that are relevant to the content of the protocol. And that is the sections that describe the sponsor and investigator responsibilities. The other ICH guidance that I mentioned earlier last week, I think, is the guidance on clinical study reports, E3. And it's something if you have the opportunity to read this, it'll be valuable to you. The first section of the protocol template is in the GCP guidance is the general information. And these are the 7 elements that are required to be included. So many companies have additional items that are considered in this category, but the minimum is to contain these 7: the protocol title, the contact information of the sponsor, any organizations like contract research organizations that are performing activities in the trial that the sponsor may delegate to, of course, the investigator information, and then at the sponsor who is authorized to approve the protocol and the protocol amendments. Just a few points about the general information. The title should be complete. It should specify these elements: the phase and elements of the design. What is the product, what's the comparison, and what's the population. One caveat to this is that some studies do contain multiple cohorts, and each might have a different design, so the protocol can't include all of this without being unnecessarily long. Protocol amendments. This is something that can create a great deal of confusion, and that's why I'm calling it out specifically. The dates of the amendment and the number of the amendment need to be on the title page of the protocol, and the dates have to be accurate. And there are many reasons for that, but the date is the date that the amendment becomes effective. I've talked about that who is responsible and accountable for the conduct of the study is in this information, specifically if the sponsor has transferred some obligations to vendors, and then of course who's the principal investigator, who's responsible for conducting the study at the investigational site. Next is the background information. This section is actually quite important because it sets the stage for the protocol. It's the introduction, and I'm going to go into this in a bit of detail. The GCP guidance list is the minimum information that this section should contain. And so what they list here are a description of the product and findings from non-clinical studies or clinical studies that are relevant to the particular design, this particular study, a summary of the risks, and if any benefits are known at the time the protocol is drafted, they should be included. Justification for the dose, the route of administration, the regimen, and then the duration of treatment in the study. A statement, importantly, that it's going to be conducted in compliance with the protocol and GCP and the applicable regulations, a description of the population, and then any references to the literature that are included. The GCP guidance includes that in the list of these items. As it's really critically important that this be done well, and it's often not done well. And that's one of the reasons why I'm going to spend some time on it. It should be complete, fit for purpose, and clear. And as we discussed with the drug development plan, there's prep work that needs to be done. The relevant literature has to be reviewed, and there has to be a knowledge of the regulations and standards that are in place at the time that the protocol is planned. These change over time, so the assumptions that were made a couple of protocols ago may not be appropriate as each individual protocol is being planned. The knowledge of the drug that's generated to date, it's not a data dump. It should be, what is specific to the protocol. One way to think about this that's helpful is to think who's the audience for this background information. So at the sponsor, it's the team members who are going to review the protocol and those who are going to approve the protocol. So the rationale needs to be carefully considered and demonstrated. The investigator needs to understand the rationale for the protocol. The investigator knows the why. Then it goes a long way toward them understanding the what, the procedures that are followed in the protocol. Very important that they know what the safety profile is, any potential safety issues, and that also helps the investigator understand how critical it is to follow the protocol. And then the scientific merit of the protocol is reviewed by IRBs and ethics committees and, of course, health authorities. So the rationale needs to justify that. This is a section where they would get that from. So as I mentioned before, the regulatory affairs team member may not be completely familiar with the science that's summarized in this section. But even without that knowledge, their review should address these questions and these considerations that I put on these slides. So there are certain themes that should inform this section. And in addition to the appropriate background information on the disease and the drug, should very clearly describe why this particular protocol is being done at this time. Where does it fit in the development plan? And what information about the product will the results give us? And very importantly, what's the rationale for every element of the protocol for the design? All of that should really be included in the background section. Other things to consider. What are the factors that have been considered in defining the patient population? And then we mentioned before the importance that the population that's studied reflects the target population. And so this should be described. And then what data support the use of the product in this population, as I mentioned on the previous slide. What's the rationale for the dose? Often it's not completely clear in a protocol why the dose is being studied. What's the basis for it? What data have been collected that support it? And then how will efficacy be assessed in the protocol? And what's the rationale for the endpoints that have been chosen? The objectives should be, as we're going to discuss in the next section, should be very clear. And if the efficacy endpoints are exploratory, it should be noted how this is going to relate to the confirmatory trials. Particularly if there are procedures that are used that aren't standard or endpoints that are used, all of that rationale needs to be included in the protocol. The choice of the control groups. And then, importantly, how are potential safety risks going to be managed? What are they? And what measures are going to be in place for the investigator to follow? So all of this needs to be very clearly delineated in this section of the protocol. One important function that the regulatory affairs team member can fulfill is that that person on the team is most familiar with the regulatory documents that have been submitted. And this information in the protocol should be consistent with information in other regulatory documents. Creates confusion and rework when it isn't. And the section really should be a standalone. Sometimes protocols, the section refers to the investigator's brochure for details. It's really better to have this be a standalone section. And it needs to be updated with each protocol, whatever is appropriate. Sometimes companies carry through and have the same background section for every protocol. It's not necessarily applicable for the later protocols as more information is obtained. And this is just a personal thought about language in the section when the results of trials are described. Sometimes there's an overstatement of the results of trials. For example, when an exploratory study is being described, It's very difficult to say that from those results, the study that the drug is effective. And it's much better. I've provided some example language here that you can look at to just say what the results are and not overinterpret these early studies. And then also about safety. You can't really say that a drug is safe without any qualification. A drug has an acceptable safety profile, or you can say it has an acceptable or favorable benefit risk ratio, but it's really just much more important, or generally more better, to be objective when you describe the results of studies, and as I said, not overinterpret.